As news from the conflict in Ukraine continue to dominate the headlines, many are worried about what could come next. But in order to know where we may be headed, we first should look back to see how this all began, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of a man named Vladimir Putin. I'm Ryan Osborne, and this is World in Context. Hello everyone, welcome to World in Context. I'm Ryan Osborne, and welcome back to our series on the long road that ultimately led to the war in Ukraine. In the last episode, we discussed the fall of the Soviet Union, corruption in the new Russian system, and the disturbing rise of a man named Vladimir Putin. Today, we continue by taking a look at Russia's claims on NATO and the growing rift between Russia and the West after the end of the Cold War. A rift many in the West didn't even know existed, let alone was growing, until 2007 when Vladimir Putin took the stage of the Munich Security Conference and gave a fiery speech where he accused the United States of destabilizing global stability through its use of, and I quote, almost uncontrolled hyper-use of force in international relations. He accused the United States of solving every problem with bombs and shooting at every opportunity. He accused the United States of attempting to evade nuclear weapons reduction while simultaneously ranting about a U.S. proposed anti-nuclear missile shield in Poland and the Czech Republic. The speech opened the eyes of many who until now were unaware of the growing aggressive attitude of Russia towards its neighbors. Most telling of all, for the sake of this conversation, is what he said about NATO. He quoted former Secretary General NATO Manfred Warner, who said, quote, "The fact that we are not ready to place a NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm security guarantee." Putin went on to say, where are these guarantees in regards to the expansion of NATO to include former Soviet states in recent years? I think it is obvious that NATO expansion does not have any relation to modernization or to the alliance itself, Putin said, or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? Putin, in essence, accused NATO of violating security agreements that were made at the end of the Cold War never to expand past Germany. Following the speech, Senator John McCain, who is in attendance, commented that this was the most aggressive speech of a Russian leader since the end of the Cold War. Many others felt that the rant bordered upon paranoid. And while it is ironic that a man like Vladimir Putin would accuse others of solving problems with bloodshed, he did raise an interesting point. The expansion of NATO and violations of agreed-upon treaties, a popular opinion within Russia. But was there any weight to these allegations? Now, before we go on to discuss the allegations, let's talk about NATO itself. For those who don't know, NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was founded in 1949 upon the framework laid out by the Western Alliance, which in itself was a post-war alliance largely built to keep an eye on Germany and then the Soviet Union. The core understanding and concept of NATO is that an attack upon one member is an attack upon them all. So, this means that if the Soviet Union were to attack West Germany, they would also be declaring war on the United Kingdom, France, Canada, the United States, Italy, and all other member states. This is officialized under Article 5 of the NATO Charter. For any nation to join NATO, they must 1. Upheld democracy as a form of government and protect free speech. 2. Be a free market economy or be making progress towards it. 3. The nation's military must be under firm control of the civilian government. 4. It must be friendly with any neighboring nations that are within NATO and respect the sovereignty of others. 5. It must be working towards compatibility with NATO standards. Now, what this means is that NATO in and of itself is a very large and complex organization. And in order for something like this to work, there needed to be streamlining. This came in the forms of a standardization of military ranking structures and the tactics used, strategies used, doctrines, military unit composition, weapons systems had to be similar and ammunition interchangeable. Training procedures had to be similar. There had to be a common language used by all partners in the program, and they all had to train together pretty regularly. Now, this is a relatively complex change for a lot of countries and takes years to accomplish and to pull off well. Now, number 6 is that any member must be voted in by a consensus of other members of NATO. Number 7, an applicant must gain overwhelming support of its own population in a vote before joining. Now, what's interesting is despite being formed in the Cold War, NATO never saw actual military action during that period, only seeing conflict after the Cold War, when it established a no-fly zone during the Bosnian Civil War, for example, and it was heavily involved during the global war on terror. Today, in 2022, NATO has found renewed purpose in its original function as a defensive alliance against Russian aggression, and it has gotten much more public and governmental support following the invasion in Ukraine in 2022. Now, following the collapse of the Iron Curtain, Germany began the road to unification between East Germany, which was in the Eastern Bloc Warsaw Pact, and West Germany, which was in NATO. Now, this could have gotten dicey, as this meant technically that troops from both sides were going to be moving back and forth, and things could escalate relatively quickly. So talks immediately began between the Warsaw Pact and NATO and Washington, D.C. and Moscow. Then President George H.W. Bush sent his Secretary of State, James Baker, to meet with then Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. And during this meeting, Baker made the verbal promise that NATO troops would not cross the East German border further into the USSR. The following day, the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl also met with Gorbachev and made several unclear statements regarding Germany's role in NATO after reunification. Following the meeting, George H.W. Bush felt his Secretary of State and the German Chancellor had gotten a little ahead of themselves in the talks. The verbal promise made by Baker was that as NATO troops moved further into East Germany, they would halt at the border and would not continue to advance. So the verbal promise Baker made was that NATO troops would move into East Germany, but they would halt at the border and wouldn't continue into Soviet countries. He did not make any mention of barring entry of nations through the process established by NATO, however. There was never any treaty signed on the matter, and the conversations were held with the USSR, not the Russian Federation, technically a separate country entirely. When several Soviet states applied for NATO membership in the early 90s, outrage spread quickly through the Russian government, with many seeing it as an approaching threat. Many took the comments regarding NATO troops now moving beyond then East Germany's eastern border and began to claim that NATO promised not to expand at all, with some even claiming that formal and signed-upon treaties had been broken. Russian President Boris Yeltsin himself, however, who had pushed for the dissolving NATO entirely, did admit he understood why Poland wished to join the alliance. So no treaties were shredded, international laws violated, or promises betrayed. It simply comes down to a misunderstanding over a verbal agreement over troop movements, which has been manipulated as the years have gone on into a different story entirely. And as to the claims that NATO continues to grow only as an offensive action to Russia, it remains only that, a claim. Sadly, the misunderstanding and flat-out lies of many in the Russian government poison the minds of the people in the country to the west, as their leaders told them NATO was little more than a hungry wolf waiting to strike. And to some extent, this made sense from their perspective. You have to understand that Russia itself has actually been invaded quite a few times from the west. Some of the most notable ones is that the Swedes and Teutonic Knights jointly invaded Russia in 1240 in a conflict that would last until 1242. The Poles invaded Russia in 1605 to 1606. In fact, the Polish actually occupied Moscow up until a Russian uprising pushed them out in 1618. The Swedes, led by King Charles, invaded Russia in 1708, and that conflict lasted until 1709. Napoleon's French Grand Army invaded Russia in 1812. The Turks and Germans jointly invaded Russia during World War I from 1914 to 1918, and Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1945. They're very paranoid of outside invasion. When you look at their history, they have a very good reason to be. And the most secure that the Russians have ever been was during the Soviet days after World War II, when they had a number of strategic choke points that were locked down, making invasion of Russia proper nearly impossible. Though, with the fall of the USSR, they lost all of these at once. And while a number may lay within Ukraine and within Georgia, the majority of them lay within the Balkans and within NATO countries. Western Poland comes to mind. This is a serious problem for the Russians, as now a number of the places that they needed are in hostile territory. Now, this threat seemed to compound when talks started of Ukraine or Georgia potentially joining the alliance, and what ultimately be a contributing factor is to Russia invading both countries. Now, Russia has always tried to maintain these access points as much as it can. A great example of this would be the Winter War in 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland for fear that the Finnish could cross over the border and take Leningrad, or that Finland as a whole could be used as a staging area to invade further into the Soviet Union and cut off the fleet access to the north. Now, as we talk about these choke points or access ways, I'm actually going to reference the work of a man named Peter Zeihan a little bit, a brilliant geopolitical thinker and someone who predicted the war in Ukraine almost down to the day when it happened. And he has pointed out that there are 8 of these things, these access ways into Russia. There's the Tan-Altai Gap, the Central Asian Corridor, Caucasus coastal approaches, Crimea, the Bessarabian Gap, Polish Gap, Baltic Sea, and the White Sea. Now, we're going to be focusing in on 3 of those, the Bessarabian Gap, Crimea, and the Polish Gap. Now, you've heard of Crimea, and it's close to these other 2, but we're going to start with the Bessarabian Gap. Now, what the heck is that? Where is that? That is a small strip of land in modern-day Moldova that has been used by a number of armies throughout history to go both east and west. Now, it is sandwiched between the Black Sea and the Carpathian Mountains, and it is of great strategic value. It's also where modern-day Transnistria rests, which is a breakaway region of Moldova with very friendly Russian ties that permanently houses a certain amount of Russian troops. I think it's around 2,000 on average. I think it's gone up to 5,000 during the war. It sits on the border of Ukraine, and it hasn't been recognized an official country for quite some time. Now we're going to move on to the Polish Gap. Now the Polish Gap is a large section of flat terrain on the other side of the Carpathian Mountains that has been used by many invading forces that have gone into Russia throughout history, including the ones we've talked about. It separates Belarus from Kaliningrad, and it is sat between Poland and Latvia. So if you cut this off, you'd be able to cut Latvia off Poland, or you could cut off Belarus. Now, Kaliningrad, for those who don't know, is a tiny speck of land that sits between the Baltic Sea, Poland, and Latvia. That is technically part of Russia, Kaliningrad but it is of great strategic value. Now, if you look back to World War II, you'll note that the German invasion of the USSR largely went through both of these 2 gaps, the Polish Gap and the Bessarabian Gap. And following the war, and the Soviet Union made sure to capture both of these locations. If you actually look at a map of the USSR and its satellite states, you'll note that it doesn't extend much further than the Carpathian Mountains in a lot of regions. It extends to the north of them and to the south of them. Then you get into East Germany, and it doesn't go a lot further than that because they have capped that defensive position. They don't need to advance much further than that. Now, the Soviets obviously would have liked to advance much further than that, but they didn't need to. This guaranteed the safety of mainland Russia. Now, having lost all of this, the Russians weren't going to just sit back and let themselves be left vulnerable to another invasion. From their perspective, this is an existential crisis that needed to be solved, and the largest threat to that is the existence of NATO. Without NATO, they would be able to move in and take back all of that territory to keep the interior of Russia safe. The greatest tool that Russia and Vladimir Putin has used in this regard are ethnic Russians left outside of Russia. So you see, when the Soviet Union broke up, there were millions of ethnic Russians outside of Russia that now found themselves stranded. They were now citizens of a different country. They were born in Russia originally, but now they're no longer Russian. And Vladimir Putin has exploited that greatly.
World in Context will be right back after this quick ad break. Welcome back.
If we take a step back to Transnistria, that area we had talked about previously, displaced Russians in Moldova rose up into a separatist movement against the Moldovan government when the government announced that they were changing the language from Russian. Moscow backed the uprising, telling the separatists that this was a threat to their identity. These separatists refused to recognize the new Moldovan government, and there was limited fighting, during which a number of Russian troops still in Moldova following the breakup of the USSR sided with the rebels, providing arms and manpower. The conflict ultimately ended in a ceasefire that established an uneasy peace that has lasted ever since. And following a period of worsening relations between the country of Georgia and Russia, Vladimir Putin would support revolts of the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia within Georgia. Now, these two regions and the Georgian government had had dust-ups during the breakup of the Soviet Union, but they had held a ceasefire since then, all the way till 2008, when fighting broke out again. This prompted the Russian government to invade, claiming that Georgia was in the process of committing genocide against the Ossetians, a claim that would later be proven false. In 2021, the European Court for Human Rights ruled that Russia still maintained direct access over Abkhazia and South Ossetia, despite recognizing the two regions as independent. And as a result, Russia was responsible for grave human rights abuses in the region during and after the war. In 2007, Estonia removed a Soviet soldier statue, and the ethnic Russians rioted. It was an ugly affair, and the riot seems to be supported by the Russian government, who used the event to raise anti-West propaganda. Vladimir Putin put out a statement condemning Estonia for it, and the Russian government engaged in what many believe to be the first state-on-state cyber attacks. Now, this wasn't the only action that the Russians were taking. They were also working against NATO in the inside, and one of the most effective tools they found that they could use as a wedge was the oil they were exporting to Western Europe, and that Europe was happily buying. As it turned out, countries who bought a lot of oil from Russia would be less likely to impose heavy sanctions upon them, would be softer on them, and would be more welcoming towards Russian propositions in the international community. And should NATO or the United Nations come out against any action the Russians did, in violation of international law, for example, it would put these countries in a very awkward spot. The chief country that comes to mind in this is Germany, who put an enormous amount of investment of their energy into Russian oil. And a predominant thought of this was that if we linked the economies, that the Russians wouldn't act too out of line because they were just as dependent upon Western European currency as Western Europe had become dependent upon Russian oil. This obviously didn't work, and it put Germany into a very awkward position once the war in Ukraine began. Now, while oil has largely come to a stop from Russia into Western Europe, it had the potential to break the alliance apart depending on how people split. And given enough years, this may have actually been successful in its job of breaking NATO apart if something really big happened that could put a lot of stress on the alliance and pull the varying interests apart. And that's kind of one of the reasons I think that Ukraine may have actually ended up happening. By February 2022, Russia may have believed they had enough of a stranglehold on Europe through their oil exports to be able to invade Ukraine without a response being brought. Or even better, it may have caused an internal conflict in the leadership of NATO and the member states, which may have even shaken the alliance apart. Though there's something else in the timing that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about that Russia may have been hoping to capitalize on. At the end of the day, NATO's backbone has always been the United States, both economically and militarily. And the year before the invasion of Ukraine, something very big had happened. The United States had left Afghanistan, and in a rather messy fashion. It was heavily televised, the footage was horrible, and it embarrassed the United States hugely. It made the United States look incompetent in a number of ways, and it left some questioning whether or not the United States would even make a good ally going forward in the future. I believe, this is my conjecture, this is my opinion, however, I think it may have been part of Russia's calculus to invade Ukraine when they did, and in as spectacular fashion as they could, in hopes of embarrassing the United States even more and making many NATO members question whether or not the United States was still the big dog. If this was part of his calculus, obviously it backfired catastrophically, and ironically, American-made Javelin missiles would play a key role in the days following the invasion in repelling Russian armor. If the withdrawal from Afghanistan was part of Vladimir Putin's thinking, and he attempted to capitalize on it, the invasion of Ukraine had the opposite effect, making people quickly forget about Afghanistan and bringing NATO together with a common enemy, something that they hadn't had since the end of the Cold War. Quote, NATO was created in Cold War times. Today it is trying to find its place in Europe, not without difficulty. It is important that the search does not create new divisions, but promote a European unity. We believe that the plans of expanding NATO are contrary to this logic. Why sow the seeds of distrust? After all, we are no longer adversaries, we are partners. This is a quote from Boris Yeltsin, who believed very strongly that as the Soviet Union fell, NATO needed to go out the door with it, believing it was a relic of a bygone era. But to be honest, there is no reason for NATO to disband. Now, Russia argued that if NATO went away, it would create more stability. Now, at some level, I suppose this is true, as it would allow Europe to be more united in the sense that Russia would feel more included. However, in trying to bring Russia in, you would be breaking an alliance of dozens of countries. This would create a less stable Europe, not a more stable one. And in the wake of World War II, that is something that I don't think many people were keen to pursue. And in an uncertain world, at the time of the 90s, there was no telling what threats could come in the future, and having an alliance like NATO made too much sense to get rid of. So, with NATO not going anywhere, and with Russia's concerns of enemies at the gate, have they never considered just to put an application in to join the alliance themselves? This would solve all of their problems, so it would fully secure their weakened flank, and moreover, it would take away all of their main enemies, right? Well, in truth, they actually have. Kind of. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union actually did apply to join on two separate occasions, though both were seen as little more than political opportunities to score against NATO, as well as for the Soviet Union to analyze the responses given in debate between all of the NATO partners to get a better lay of the political landscape, if you will. Though, to my knowledge, since the fall of the Soviet Union, there have been no requests to join by the Russian Federation. There have been initiatives by the West and by Russia to improve relations, though all of these have broken down for one reason or another. The truth is, though, that even if Russia wanted to, even going back to the 90s, they would never be able to become a member of NATO. And Putin knows this. And the reasons for this are that, number one, it's very unlikely that the Russian people would ever go for joining NATO themselves. Number two, it's almost a near certainty that a consensus of NATO nations could not be reached in inducting Russia. This probability gets even lower once you start adding countries like Poland or Latvia that suffered under the Soviet Union before. Not to mention that the prospect of the Russian military restructuring to NATO's standards, changing their equipment, their training doctrines, their warfare doctrines, the ammunition they use, switching to speaking English during international operations, allowing foreign militaries into their borders to train. This simply would not happen. Now, it is possible that when he brings up the supposed rejections from NATO, that he is referring to the applications during the Cold War. This would not be out of character for him to refer to something such as that to be technically correct while being deceitful at the same time. The fact of the matter is, though Russia may not like it, NATO expanded not due to some dark scheme, but because many of its newest members spent decades under the brutal rule of Moscow, and fear being an isolated party at risk of being devoured, much as Russia is trying to do to Ukraine at this very moment. In this regard, NATO's greatest sin here is that they left the door open, and Hungary, the Czech Republic, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and soon Sweden, Finland, as independent nations chose to walk through. No one was forced to join here, and these countries chose to join for their safety. But unfortunately, the damage has been done, and the NATO rift between Russia and the West, fueled by lies, misinformation, and misunderstanding, has fed into Putin's slow crawl towards total control. I originally wanted the second part of the series to be about Russia's wars since the fall of the Soviet Union. However, I very rapidly realized that it would be missing very important context. Therefore, I decided to do this episode first. So next week, we'll be diving into Russia's wars since the fall of the Soviet Union and the ramp up to the war in Ukraine. But in the meantime, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Ryan Osborne, and this has been World in Context.